On Wednesday, October 14th, CoinDesk is throwing an Invest Ethereum Economy virtual event, which I'm really excited that CoinDesk is getting into the Ethereum space more. Vitalik Buterin is going to talk there, as well as Heath from the CFTC. And I am also giving a talk as well on the bull case of Ether. So here I am right down here. DeFi Dad is also talking. Rune Christensen is also talking. Some really all-stars who are giving some really fantastic talks. So I've seen the schedule. I've seen the list of talks, and I'm really excited about it. They've done a really good job picking out the right topics. There's a link in the show notes where you can register with the code Bankless to get 25% off of your ticket. So get that ticket and then watch me talk about how awesome Ether the asset is.
Okay, guys, we are back. We've got Jake Chervinsky, and we are talking about regulation and what it means for DeFi. You know, Jake, part of me wonders, like, is the kind of regulators, is it sort of like the Eye of Sauron from like Lord of the Rings, where it just like it's sweeping the land, and right now it found Bitmex, and its eyes turned to Bitmex. And I think the question in everyone's mind is, what are the regulators going to do with DeFi? Because DeFi is no longer a small niche market, right? So we have Uniswap, and it just last month surpassed Coinbase in terms of trading volume. Like, that's a pretty large market for crypto. How long until the Eye of Sauron turns its eye on like decentralized exchanges, for instance, maybe a Uniswap, and DeFi as a whole? And once it does turn its eye on DeFi, what does it do?
Yeah, so it's a funny comparison. I guess it's more like the Eye of Sauron with a 2-year lag, right? So like, and also, I mean, it's not really the Eye of Sauron, because I think we have a little more respect for our regulators than that. But look, regulators are already paying attention to DeFi. There's no question about that. There are different levels of understanding about DeFi depending on which regulatory agency you're talking about. But as you're showing here, there is some concern about DeFi and compliance with anti-money laundering laws like the Bank Secrecy Act. I think this article is a little bit sensational, and I disagree with that headline, which seems a little bit clickbaity to me, but we can get into that. But FinCEN in particular is very sophisticated in thinking about DeFi. I guess if the question is, when, if ever, do we see enforcement actions or settlements related to DeFi? My sense is,
before you go on, Jake, just for the podcast listeners, so the headline I'm pulling up is called "Booming Decentralized Finance: A Potential Haven for Money Laundering," and this was published in Bloomberg. That was the headline you were referring to.
Yeah, so I respectfully disagree with the author on that one. We can sort of get into why. I think the risk is a lot lower than that might represent. But, I think enforcement actions are a little bit far off. I think that it will just take longer for regulators to understand the technology and then figure out who the right subjects are for regulation, and whether and to what extent there have been actual violations of those regulatory frameworks. So I think it's the early days, but just like in 2017, there was a lot of identification of activity that seemed pretty clearly to violate the securities laws. I think there are various elements of, I think, what people may call DeFi, but which I would dispute as to whether it's really decentralized, that, in a couple of years, we'll be seeing some pretty obvious enforcement actions related to those.
So Jake, what are like the carve-outs for DeFi right now, right? So it seems to be there is one like point of differentiation from a Bitmex versus something that's more DeFi, is certainly custody of assets, right? So with Bitmex, you have to deposit your Bitcoin. They retain custody of your assets in order to use their derivative services. With most DeFi, you don't have to, like with DeFi that's actually more on the decentralized spectrum, you don't have to do that. A smart contract, ideally autonomous, non-controlled smart contract, kind of takes ownership of that. Is that a key carve out, I guess? And maybe in particular, I think it's more interesting to talk about sort of the Eye of Sauron with respect to like the Bank Secrecy Act and FinCEN. Is that a difference? And what other differences will a group like FinCEN kind of make?
Yeah, so I wouldn't call it a carve out. I would say it's an important fact that changes whether regulation applies or not. And we always have to remember a couple things. One is Decentralization is not a magic cure, right? It's not a perfect defense to all regulation. Decentralization is a tool that reduces risk in certain ways. And some of the ways in which it reduces risk means that traditional regulations no longer apply the way they do to centralized systems. You also have to remember regulations don't apply to technology. They apply to people and their conduct. So the question isn't necessarily, is DeFi regulated or is a DeFi protocol regulated? The question is, are there people using DeFi protocols who are subject to regulation? In the example you give about whether a system is custodial or not, that is really important for some regulatory frameworks and some classifications of regulated institutions under those frameworks, including the Bank Secrecy Act. So the main question that we look at under the Bank Secrecy Act, and that FinCEN has provided a lot of guidance about, is whether or not crypto systems are money transmitters or money services businesses. A money transmitter is an entity that receives funds from one person and transmits those funds to another person or location. And a money transmitter needs to be registered with FinCEN, and it needs to have an AML compliance program, including KYC. A centralized exchange is a money transmitter. It's probably a number of other regulatory classifications as well. But for starters, it's a money transmitter. It receives funds in the form of deposits from its customers. It transmits those funds back to customers at different wallet addresses. Therefore, it is regulated under the Bank Secrecy Act. A DeFi protocol which is non-custodial arguably does not perform money transmission. And FinCEN has actually put out some really helpful guidance on this. In particular, in May of last year, May of 2019, they put out sort of a summary of their analysis of the different categories of market participants in crypto, including users, administrators, and exchangers of digital assets. And basically, from that guidance, the lesson to be learned is a purely non-custodial platform that does not have a centralized operator that is performing this service of money transmission is not a regulated financial institution, and therefore does not need to have an AML compliance program. So that's why being non-custodial is very important. The one thing I'll add to that, though, is being a money transmitter is one of many types of regulated financial institutions that has to comply with the BSA. Another totally different classification is a futures commission merchant, right? What Bitmex was classified as by the CFTC. If you are a futures commission merchant in FCM, you also have Bank Secrecy Act obligations, whether your FCM is custodial or not. So being non-custodial is not a cure for Bank Secrecy Act regulation.
Wow. Okay. So like falling in the first category, I guess traditionally you'd think of something like a wallet, right? So like a MetaMask, for instance, not to put specific companies or projects on this, but that would be something that probably falls outside of the Bank Secrecy Act and FinCEN's jurisdiction.
Yes, and FinCEN actually said in their guidance pretty clearly that a quote unquote unhosted wallet, and by that what they mean is a wallet that is purely under the control of the user, is not money transmission, right? The creator of that unhosted wallet is basically just a software developer that put out a piece of software, but that developer does not have custody of the user's funds. And the user, as long as they're using cryptocurrency on their own behalf, right, for their own account, their own purposes, then they're not performing money transmission for other people. So that's why an unhosted wallet is not subject to Bank Secrecy Act regulation.
And that's kind of, Jake, the case of like so far, right? That's how kind of FinCEN has issued guidance that so far that seems to be the case. I guess, maybe the question is, right, so we talked about earlier what the SEC and CFTC, what their goals are, right? But FinCEN, the Bank Secrecy Act goals are completely different. They're really like, we're trying to prevent like terrorist types of events. We're trying to prevent a category of financial activity that like child pornography, these sorts of things that kind of goes against the laws and ethics of the United States, right? So like, is it possible that this kind of mandate starts to creep into these other like transactions? Like what about individual civil liberties, right? So like, can FinCEN or like the Bank Secrecy Act or the DOJ start to broaden their mandate to say, well, individual US citizens cannot use, say, a Uniswap or some decentralized exchange? Like, how broad is their mandate when their entire reason for existence is to stop terrorist activity? It seems pretty broad.
Yeah, you're hitting a really important point, and this, I think, is going to be the policy battle for our space in the coming years, and it's been heating up a lot in just even the last couple of months. So I guess a couple things on this. The first is FinCEN is a regulatory agency. They do not make the law, they interpret the law. They also can pass their own implementing regulations. But if you want to have a change to the Bank Secrecy Act, that would have to come from the US Congress. Right now, the Bank Secrecy Act, the statute, is what says that only regulated financial institutions are subject to the AML compliance program obligations of the law. And an unhosted wallet just doesn't fit any of those definitions of a regulated financial institution. So the question is, number one, to what extent might FinCEN want to exert more authority over unhosted wallets or peer-to-peer transactions? And number two, how could the law change to be more restrictive of these kinds of transactions? I think stepping back from the technical legal analysis, it is important to note that what we are building is a parallel financial system that allows the transfer of basically any amount of value to anyone, anywhere, almost instantly, almost for free, without any ability of governments to censor or surveil those transactions.
Right.
That is a threatening sounding type of technology. And there is just a really big ongoing policy question whether regulators are going to be okay with that. You know, the world we live in right now is a world where regulators are more or less comfortable having surveillance of the on-ramps and off-ramps into the crypto ecosystem, right? So if you want to get US dollars into Ether or Ether back into US dollars, you're gonna have to do that through a regulated exchange. That's why you have an account at Coinbase or Gemini or Kraken, or name your on-ramp or off-ramp into crypto. But then the transactions, once you're in the crypto ecosystem, right? Once you have your Ether in your MetaMask wallet and you're moving it around between different DeFi protocols, there is basically no regulation, or at least no requirement of reporting or KYC at that point. I think where we're heading, there's basically two directions we can go from here. One is policymakers understand the benefits and the value of that kind of financial activity, right? The whole point of what we're building is a system where people can actually own their own assets. They don't have to rely on trusted third parties, centralized custodians, to manage their assets for them and also manage their personal identifying information for them. We know how that goes, right? Not terribly well. And also policymakers who understand the civil liberties issues that Ryan was mentioning, right? I believe that financial privacy is a really important right. And I believe the right to own your own assets is really important. The other version, though, and this frankly is what we're hearing more from policymakers now, and I can tell you, I do a lot of work here in Washington, D.C., where I'm based, talking to regulators and legislators about these issues, is a desire to create a fully custodial system, right? Where you cannot withdraw crypto assets from a traditional intermediated financial system. And the way that they're sort of right now thinking about creating that barrier between the custodial system and sort of the open DeFi system is to say that exchanges, those on-ramps and off-ramps, are not allowed to perform transactions with unhosted wallets, or that they have to KYC unhosted wallets before they can do the transaction. In other words, you have to prove that your Ledger hardware wallet or your MetaMask account is yours before the exchange can allow you to withdraw to that wallet.
Oh my God.
Or there could be transaction limits, right? You can only withdraw $500 a day, something like that. And this is actually heating up as an issue. And I think in the next 6 months or so, this is something that we need to start arguing about.
That sounds like a direct attack on the Bankless Nation.
That's what it is. And And it sounds, pessimistic, but this is what has happened in Switzerland. So there is the Swiss rule, which says that VASPs, virtual asset service providers, have to verify the beneficial owner of an unhosted wallet before they can do a transaction to that unhosted wallet. This is all under the auspices of the travel rule, which you've probably heard about before. And the result of this basically is Swiss institutions refuse to process transactions to unhosted wallets because they don't know how to comply with that requirement.
This is okay. So, David, you wrote a piece on Bankless on Monday about kind of the Bitmex case being sort of like dividing the crypto community a little bit. And I've got to say, I'm somewhat divided on it too, right? So on the one hand, I totally agree with regulator mandate to basically let's get the bad actors out of the space. So to the extent that Bitmex can cheat or take funds away or basically have their service operate as a black box, so you have no transparency into what's going on,
and therefore allegedly trade against their own customers.
Exactly.
Right.
So to the extent they were doing that, that's a bad actor. Okay, regulator, there's a bad actor in the space.
Do your job and thank you.
Yes. But the other side of this is to the extent that regulators, not just regulators, nation states want to clamp down on civil liberties, things that if I pay you in cash money, David, right? There's no AML KYC going on. If I give you a bar of gold, the transaction has completed and the nation state doesn't need to get involved. And that's where, Jake, I got to be honest, I'm pessimistic, and it's concerning to me because even this week we get stuff like this. I'm gonna show it on my screen. I tweeted this, but the EarnIt Act is in front of Congress right now. And this is basically legislation that is attacking internet encryption and privacy on the internet. This is in front of the House right now with some supporters, bipartisan support. And it's we need help with COVID. We don't need this kind of thing. So I'm worried, quite frankly, Jake, that our boomer legislators are going to go with option 2 and instead try to institute this whole authoritarian, we need to know every single transaction in and out. There are no peer-to-peer money transmissions that the government doesn't have an eye into. There's no such thing as financial privacy anymore. Now that it's digital, we somehow have a right to see everything that happens if you're a citizen of the nation. And quite frankly, that is terrifying to me. Jake, is there any hope here? Please say that someone is willing to preserve our civil liberties at the nation state level.
There is hope. There's definitely hope. I am worried. I'm probably one of the more worried people, working on these policy issues. And I do think we need to take it seriously, but I do think there's hope. I think we have really good arguments. And, I hate to be sort of too much of a patriotic American, but I do think especially we have really strong constitutional arguments, arguments that really speak to American principles about First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights. I think financial privacy is something that we care about a lot in America. I don't think we want to have a system like a more authoritarian country like China has set up, where the government can see absolutely everything that everyone is doing at all times. So I do think we have good constitutional arguments, good principled arguments. I also think we have to look at this from the other side of the equation. So when you go to policymakers and all you do is handwave about how amazing this new innovative technology is, they don't really hear those arguments as much as they do when you say the risk that you're concerned about is actually pretty low, right? Think about what the policymakers are concerned about. They're concerned that terrorists are going to use this technology to perpetrate attacks on our country, to hurt innocent people, to carry out crimes that none of us want to happen, right? We do not want to see child abuse in the world or terrorist attacks in the world. We don't want to see DeFi being used by ISIS and Hamas and Al-Qaeda. That is not something that we want. So what we have to do is also make arguments about why those risks aren't that serious right now, and why concerns about some future world where terrorists are all of a sudden doing all of their business through DeFi, which is not what's happening now. Don't get me wrong, right? There is basically none of that happening right now. There's very little actual use of crypto.
They're doing it with bills, right? With Benjamins, with cash
US dollar,
money,
the US dollar
US dollars,
is
yeah.
by far and away the most used currency for criminal purposes. And so you want to say to policymakers, look, we understand the risk. There are ways to mitigate those risks. We're fine with regulation of those on-ramps and off-ramps, right? It's okay for something like Bitmex to have to perform KYC of its customers. But also don't kill the innovation that's happening in this new world that is trying to compete with the centralized version that China is building, right? Or that other, I guess you could call them foreign adversaries of the US and the sort of Western world, where they will control everything that happens on these systems. Don't kill that version of this technology for fear of something that isn't really happening right now. And instead consider other ways to attack the problem other than the overbroad act of just shutting down all innovation completely.
I feel like it's the case, Jake, that we have a kind of a fight on our hands. And what I mean is like so many in kind of crypto, they want to remove themselves from nation state politics, right? Personally, I don't advocate that at all, right? So like, I think that if we want to preserve our civil liberties, right, we actually have to engage in political discussions. We actually have to vote. We actually have to persuade lawmakers as to our case. Like, it's almost like we have to refight for our constitutional rights in the digital age, like, because they do seem to be eroding all around us. So like, what can people do, Jake? I mean, it feels like so much of this is just pushed on us and foisted on us. Are there groups talking to legislators in Washington about these issues? Like, should we inform ourselves on who to vote for? What kinds of things can the people do, the Bankless Nation do, to like push these in the direction of option one rather than option two, where we go full authoritarian?
Yeah, there's a lot that we can do, and I think everyone needs to be engaged in this issue, because if they're not, it is very easy for elected officials to crush this space, right? At the end of the day, our politicians, say what you want about American democracy and the state in which it finds itself today, they are at least supposed to carry out the will of the people. And so we need to make clear what the benefits of this technology are and make clear what we want to see happen in the space. There's a couple organizations to know about that are working on these issues. One is Coin Center. Coin Center has put out some amazing research and papers on this very issue. One of my favorite papers is by their executive director, Jerry Brito, on digital cash and financial privacy, arguing why this is extremely important to a free society. That's a really important piece of work to read. There's the Blockchain Association, which is a trade association here in DC. I'm one of the co-chairs of its DeFi working group, along with Jason Somonsato at 0x and Brian Avello, who's the general counsel at Maker. And we are engaging with policymakers often to discuss these issues and argue about why onerous regulation isn't necessary. There's the Chicago DeFi Alliance. We're working on a task force to also advance some of these policy arguments. But really what people need to do is start getting educated about what the policy arguments are, why it is important to a free society to have digital cash, why we should not treat a public blockchain like Ethereum like a wire transfer system in the traditional financial system, and sort of why we should allow innovation to flourish, what the benefits are, and why they outweigh the risks.
I guess dangling that carrot in front of our lawmakers is important. And this is all not all bad news. We saw SEC Chair Clayton talk about tokens, like all stocks becoming tokenized at some point in the future. So on the flip side to what you're saying, Jake, there does seem to be kind of a carrot in front of the US, the nation state lawmakers, to say, look, you don't want to get left behind of this innovative technology. The future is quite clearly digital. It's internet native. It's programmable. If we can somehow preserve our civil liberties in the process, right, then the Bankless Nation wins. But that is, I guess, the challenge that's in front of us. Last question for you, Jake. And thank you so much for spending time with us on these subjects. It's hard to wrap our heads around when we hear these headlines, and you've distilled it quite well. But I guess the question is, how long will it take for all of this stuff to shake out, do you think? So are we talking on the order of years? Like, are we talking on the order of decades? If things go the optimistic route, where do you see us in 10 years?
I do think it's years to decades. It depends on a lot of different factors. It depends on how effective we are in making these arguments. And I mean, just to wrap up the thought that you just put out about Jay Clayton sort of seeming to approve for the first time I've seen about, tokenizing securities. There are policymakers who are on our side. This is not us versus them. Brian Brooks, who's the controller of the currency, is a big fan of crypto in general. The deputy director at FinCEN is sort of a fan of what we're doing. So there are people who sort of identify with the mission, or at least are interested in sort of the benefits that these technologies can offer. But where do we go in the next 10 years? I think that it partly depends on what the traditional financial system's response is to crypto as it grows. So one of the fights we haven't really had yet is with the banks, right? So, I mean, bring this full circle, right? We're on the Bankless State of the Nation today. The question is, does JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley and Bank of America and et cetera, do they all decide that it's us versus them? Did they decide that they need to start pushing policymakers to tamp down on what we're building in the DeFi space? Or is there some world where we play together, where there's some new role for those banks to serve? And that's something that we've been talking about a lot in the DeFi space. There are ways where it's not necessarily a bankless world. It's just that banks look very different from how they look today, right? They're not custodying our assets. They're not performing this very capital intensive role. They're serving a different purpose. They're service providers. They're sort of launching their own products and services on top of blockchain-based decentralized finance protocols. I think if we can get to that world where this doesn't seem like such a threat, and we can then make a really strong argument that supporting innovation in DeFi is good for American citizens, and it's good for free enterprise and for fair and open markets, that in a way, it is a good response to the geopolitical threat that we're facing now, where there are other countries going more toward a socialist or even more of a communist approach to their own financial systems. Then in 10 years, we could be in an extremely good situation where DeFi is the financial infrastructure of the Western world. And no one even thinks twice about the fact that under the hood of the app that you have on your phone is a DeFi protocol, as opposed to a traditional financial software on a server or something like that. We just really need to pay attention to what the risks are that we go in the other direction and do our best to sort of guide policymakers to the right place.
I'm glad we're ending on an optimistic note here, because I do think everything you said is optimistic, Jake. And one other thing I'll say is we largely got through the open communication protocol of the internet with a fairly free and neutral and open internet. We did that with the help of regulators and legislators. There were bumps along the road. It was not perfect. But largely, the internet that we had in the 1990s and the 2000s came through relatively unscathed. It's possible we might be able to do that with DeFi and these open finance protocols. David, do you have anything else that's optimistic, man?
Yeah, Jake, you're talking about how a lot of this depends on what legacy financial institutions do. And I'm reminded of the podcast that we just released on Moloch, where it would take a lot for every single legacy financial system to all agree to be on the same page as be anti-crypto or anti-DeFi, right? Because the more banks that sign up to be anti-crypto or anti-DeFi, the more likely it is for one to defect and become like the CeFi DeFi bank that spans across both, right? And so that makes me optimistic that there's always going to be the incentive to be that one bank that's crypto friendly and then hopefully the market rewards them. And then I think the other thing that makes me optimistic, Jake, is that you rattled off a list of DeFi working groups along with Coin Center, that there are actual people like you. So thank you, tip of the hat, Jake, for defending the nation. There are people coordinating around the need to get ahead of this problem, right? And to make sure that when the boomers leading this country get informed with what's actually going on from people that are in the space. And so, Jake, I do see that as your role as perhaps protector of the DeFi nation. So thank you with everything you do. And also thank you for coming on the Bankless State of the Nation to get us educated as to what's going on in this world.
My pleasure, guys. Great to talk to you.